Hey, great to see one of the top media personalities in all of MLB, Emmy Award winner Ken Rosenthal. Ken, welcome to Questions for Cancer Research. How are you?
Chris, I'm fine, thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, that's great. Despite what some may think, I know that it's anything but an off season for you with the free agent signing period. A few
That's
big names.
absolutely correct.
Yeah, you've been pretty busy. I know that. A few big names still left out there on the board. Any hope for Met fans, or will Pete Alonso be signing elsewhere?
There's always hope until he does sign elsewhere, if that indeed happens. I
Yeah.
don't know that anyone's going to close the door. That's not the way free agency works. Now, the Mets have basically announced that they've pivoted, and they have to some degree pivoted by signing Jesse Winker and AJ Minter. But if Pete Alonso and them could reach an agreement tomorrow on a price that both deemed fair, that would happen. They still need another big bat with Soto coming aboard, and I don't know that this is going to happen. I get the sense that the Mets don't really want Pete Alonso, to be perfectly honest, but
Really?
I will not rule it out.
Why? No, that's pretty interesting to say that they don't want him. Is that, just they think they can't afford the price, or do you think that it's a new direction for them?
No, I think it's the player. And listen, Pete Alonso's done some great things in a Mets uniform. He's one of the top sluggers in the game, but he is getting into his 30s. He's not the most athletic guy. He's not a great defender. And it just seems to me they are not willing to commit, certainly long term, to such a player, and even short term at the salary that he would want. Now, that's the way it has been so far.
Yeah.
Alonso came back to them and said, hey, we're willing to do short term, 3 years with opt outs. And they couldn't even reach an agreement on that. The Mets' offer to him was reported to be 3 years, 68 to 70 million, in that range. That's an offer they had to know he wasn't going to take. That after that happened, Chris, is when I thought they don't really want this relationship to necessarily continue.
Yeah, yeah. Well, with the Mets, let me ask you about the biggest news of the offseason. The Mets signing Juan Soto to the largest contract in the history of sports. That's really big for MLB and the Mets. 15-year, $765 million deal. Ultimately, we don't know what led Juan to accept the Mets offer, but obviously the Mets beat out a very aggressive Yankees team that was looking to retain its talented right fielder. The Yankees made it to the World Series this year for the first time since 2009, greatly benefiting from the amazing Aaron Judge Juan Soto tandem. I guess it's fair to say that things have changed considerably since Steve Cohen purchased the Mets. Ken, after years of Steinbrenner dominance in the New York baseball market, how meaningful is it that the Mets beat out the Yankees for Juan Soto?
From that perspective, very meaningful. And I actually grew up in New York. I grew up a Mets fan, and I lived for the day that the Mets would do something like this. Now, let me give you the caveat. People are going to say, oh, he's a Mets. No, I don't root for any team. I cover all 30. That whole thing is long gone, the fandom
Yeah,
of any team, I should say. But I know how Mets fans think. I know how Mets fans
yeah,
feel. And there's always been this feeling, and rightly so, honestly, because the Yankees have been around much longer than the Mets in New York, that the Mets were the little brother of the equation. This changes that. Now, obviously, the Yankees are still going to have a massive amount of fans. They're still going to be the team in New York for many people. They had a big offseason themselves. Max Fried and Cody Bellinger and Paul Goldschmidt. They've done some interesting things to kind of try to move on without Soto. But this was Soto choosing the Mets over the Yankees, and that was a big deal. Now, he didn't get much more money from the Mets, but he talked about how they portrayed a family environment to him, and that meant a lot to him. I don't know that he couldn't have had a family environment with the New York Yankees, but whatever the Mets said and promised, and they did give him that suite where the Yankees were not willing to do that. I can't imagine that's what made his decision, but they
yeah.
did portray themselves in a way to him that was really appealing. And that's why it seems, at least from his perspective, that he made that decision. Now, how this changes the dynamic of the two teams, the Mets are going to have to win. And they haven't won a World Series since 1986. The Yankees have only won one in the last many years, 2009. So it's going to be really interesting to see how this plays out. The Mets have built a very good team as well, and I expect it to be an exciting season for both clubs.
Yeah, it's funny for Yankee fans. They kind of had a double hit after the final game of the World Series when they lost to the Dodgers. It was tough enough absorbing the loss, but when they asked Juan after the game, what are your thoughts on free agency? And he kind of came out and said, "Hey, I'm open to speaking to all 30 teams." So that was kind of some tough writing on the wall for the Yankees. There was a lot of hope, but yeah, the Mets went out, and I will say one thing. It's funny, as you said, we don't know, what it all came down to, but the Mets did give him the suite for his family, and the Yankees said, "Hey, we just have never done that." And you look at the list of team players they've had over the years, so the Mets have started a tough precedent there. So if they're going to continue down the line that the Yankees have, they're going to have to build out a bunch of suites there if they're going to continue that with the big name players.
Chris, if you go back some time to when A-Rod was a free agent, when he was leaving the Mariners, and the Mets were very involved with him. He ultimately signed with Texas, of course. But Steve Phillips, who was the general manager at the time, said, we don't want to create a 24 plus one culture. Back then, there were 25-man rosters. And with Soto, to some degree, the Mets are creating a 25 plus one culture. And granted, he's Juan Soto. He's a great player. He's a free agent. He had the right to do whatever he wanted as a free agent. That's really important to remember. These guys have the right to choose. And even that comment after the World Series was over when he said, "Hey, I'm open to every team," that's his right. He worked long and hard to get there, 6 years as a major leaguer. So that part of it, I don't have a problem with. The culture of the Mets, that might be interesting to follow because as much as players love playing with great players, they all have their own pride. And pride in baseball for players is often measured not just by statistics, but by salaries. So you look at Francisco Lindor. He's the Mets' best player before Juan Soto. Might be the best all-around player, even with Juan Soto. He's making less than half of Juan Soto, at least in total overall value of his contract. Lindor is not the jealous type. I don't expect this to cause friction or anything like that, but this is a dynamic worth watching for sure.
Yeah, it takes so much to be professionals, and all this makes me think back to the Yankee teams, as you said. When A-Rod did go to the Yankees, and I don't know, I think I recall something in his contract, but that they were on the road. If the Yankees played in a city where there was a Four Seasons, A-Rod was going to stay at the Four Seasons in a suite, and the Yankees would stay somewhere else, and there was always a little talk that, he always was treated a little bit different in the locker room. But at the end of the day, Jeter and those guys were professionals, whether they liked it or not. For the most part, they made it work. So I guess that will be incumbent upon those Met players to say, "Hey, we're all about winning, and we're just going to have to make the best of it." But the money is big. I mean, that's a big deal.
No doubt. And as much as I anticipated him getting a monster deal, when the numbers came out that night, I was stunned.
You were
I
stunned.
don't know
Yeah,
that anyone anticipated one, more than Shohei Ohtani's total value, and two, just the length and the size of this deal. The length, perhaps we could have guessed because he is young, but the
right.
size of it is just staggering. And I remember, Chris, I wrote at one point while it was before he was a free agent. It was probably during the season. I believe that was when it was. I wrote that, or I said on some show that he's going to get more in average annual value, present day value per year than Shohei. And Shohei's present day value per year is 46. And people are like, "Oh, that's crazy. How can he get more than Shohei?" Well, it turns out not only did he beat Shohei's present day average salary, he beat his actual average salary. Actually, he didn't do that because it's over 15 years, but the total
Yeah,
value of the deal was
yeah.
higher. That's just stunning to me.
Yeah, I mean, and I think probably with the numbers getting that big, people probably would have expected to see some deferred money in that contract, right? I mean, there was nothing deferred, but probably what people were expecting to see some of that.
No question. I was expecting to see that.
You
And
were, yeah,
that was the other shocker that there was no deferred money in it. It really, he got almost anything a player could have wanted in that deal. I had
yeah,
someone joke to me afterward saying, "What exactly did the Mets say no to?" Because there are opt outs, there are all kinds of goodies in this deal. And that's a
yeah.
good question. I don't know what the Mets said no to. It seemed like they said yes to everything.
Listen, I grew up in New York. I'm a Yankee fan. I had Met fans in my family, so they're awfully excited about the future. Funny, on ESPN last night, Steve Cohen was on TV. He's the owner of the golf team in this new TGL league. So he was down here in Palm Beach with that. So he's made a killing in the world, in the hedge fund world, but he's obviously loving the world of sports, and probably very good news for Met fans these days, without a doubt. And next one's pretty interesting. I wrote out this next question a couple days ago, then saw last night that you wrote a really good article yesterday in the Athletic on this topic. So let me ask the question first, and then there's a bunch of things we can get into on this. So Chicago Cubs owner Tom Ricketts recently said the business model in baseball, it's worked pretty well for a long time, but there's a few things right now that are just a little out of kilter. He went on to say that the Cubs' plan is to break even each year financially, and they simply can't keep up with the spending of the Dodgers, the Yankees, and the Mets. Steve Cohen has an estimated net worth north of $20 billion. It seems reasonable to expect that we'll see more multi-billionaires purchase franchise in the world of sports leagues in the coming years. MLB has a competitive balance tax or luxury tax, as others might consider it. However, as deeper pockets move into MLB, is it time to seriously consider the implementation of a hard salary cap and floor? And you wrote an article basically saying it's not. So just kind of give me a recap of your thoughts. I mean, this is really probably as timely as anything, right? With what's going on, and do we have haves and have-nots? And but kind of give me your overview on all this.
Sure. It's a complicated question. And it's complicated because the disparity economically between the haves and the have-nots in the sport, and I'm not including the Cubs as a have-not, by the way, that seems to be growing. And that is a legitimate concern because, of course, you want true competition. Now, there are endless amounts of evidence that shows that baseball, compared to even the salary cap sports, has more competitive balance. If you look at the fact that no team has repeated as champion since 1998 to 2000, when the Yankees won 3 straight, that is clearly an indicator of that. People talk about a salary cap as if that would just make everything better. And I don't know that it would change all that much. We see dominant super teams in the NFL and the NBA. And yes, we're seeing it in baseball. I don't know that it's such a bad thing to have this villain team, this team that spends everything, the team that everyone is shooting for. I don't know that that's a bad thing. And the other part of a salary cap, besides the fact that it isn't free market at that point, but the players have historically been opposed to this, and opposed to it to the extent that if the owners push it, even if they implement a floor along with it, which would seemingly raise salaries for lower revenue teams, even if they did that, the players would be opposed. They don't want any restrictions on the market. And what we would have then is a work stoppage. We've had work stoppages in baseball before, but I don't believe that this sport right now, in its place in American society, can afford to have a work stoppage when it finally has some positive momentum, thanks in large part to the pitch clock that was introduced 2 years ago by the league. And attendance has been up the last 2 years. A lot of good things are happening. So basically what I wrote is, you want to talk about a salary cap, fine, but teams need to compete to their capabilities at a better level than they do now. Some of the smaller market teams take their revenue sharing money and don't seem to spend it on the major league club. Even some of the mid and larger market teams don't spend to their capabilities, at least in my opinion. Now, when Tom Ricketts says, hey, we're just trying to break even, okay, but you're not showing us your books, and I can't believe you until I see evidence of what you're saying. And when he talks about breaking even, is he talking about simply baseball operations, or is he talking about the development around Wrigley? What is going into this stew? So that to me is the answer. If Chris, we're getting more multi-billionaires into the sport, well, good. Get more multi-billionaires into the sport, and maybe we need a new ownership class of people who are going to spend, maybe not to the degree that the Dodgers can, because no team has that economic foundation, and maybe not to the degree that the Mets and Yankees can. But this sport has always been built on local revenue. And it's the model of it. It's why it's different than the NFL, which is built on national television revenue. And a better ownership class, or a wealthier, more ambitious ownership class, I'd like to see that before I see a salary cap.
Yeah, and I guess that, we're in the middle of that transformation, right? I mean, the numbers have gotten so big. the franchise valuations have gotten up there. So, it takes big dollars to kind of come in. And it's funny, I see almost a little differentiation because people would say, well, now we've got private equity money coming in. So that's, more capital available. But and private equity at this point will not really have a say in management of the teams. But private equity likes to run businesses in a very profitable manner, and I don't know what, Steve Cohen's ultimate ambition is, to say, hey, is this going to be like the Dodgers where we're spending a ton of money, but we're also bringing in a ton of money. And at the end of the day, I'm going to make money. Or is it going to be a bunch of billionaires saying, hey, I'm worth $20 billion and I want to win one of these things and I don't care how much money I lose. But I do think the writing's on the wall that, if you're going to own one of these things, this is really becoming a big boys club. And I think that it started, and I think that will continue.
I would agree. And a couple of points on that. So obviously, franchise values, as you mentioned, have risen, and that's a really important point. Now, I know what baseball people say, or the ownership side, the management side will say, and that's when you have a house that increases in value, you don't base your spending each year, your budgets, annual budgets, on what you think the house will sell for. But at the same time, while that's a very valid argument, we're talking about different scales, much different scales. And in the Cubs case, I don't know the numbers off the top of my head. I can't recall. They're in the column. And their franchise value has increased exponentially. So they know that. They know they can sell at any time for a number. If it's not what Forbes says it is, it's certainly a big number. And fans want to know, well, why then do you have to adhere strictly to the intake, the revenue you're getting each year in terms of what you're putting back into the club, especially when there's other revenue coming in and we don't even know what the revenue is. So I understand the owner's desire is what any management's desire is always hold down costs. But at the same time, there is a competitive element to this sport that I don't know that is being exercised to the fullest by every franchise. And again, I want to make this clear. I don't expect the Pittsburgh Pirates to spend like the Los Angeles Dodgers. They simply cannot. But can they spend more than they're spending? Can they show greater effort? And that's just one example. Yes, they could.
Yeah, yeah. I'm going to return back to this topic in a later question because for the middle or smaller market teams, it is pretty interesting that where they find themselves with revenue sharing versus spending. As far as the Players Association goes, I mean, obviously they don't want any cap on what players can be paid, right? I mean, that's
Right.
wonderful for them. They're saying, hey, we're giving something up on the floor or not having a floor, but I mean, at some point, if you got a bunch of people in here who just said, hey, I don't care if I win or lose money, I want to win championships, it's probably not a good business model long term, right? I mean, that could eventually really collapse. I mean, at some point, does the Players Association need to say, look, we're making our guys are making a lot of money. We've got good conditions. Do you think there needs to be a softening at some point on their stance? Because obviously there's so much money right now for anyone to say, hey, we're going to have a work stoppage right now would really be a tough move to make. But do you think the Players Association has to start maybe, opening up their stance on a salary cap?
It's a good question. And there are some, even on the players' side, who believe this could work. It could work if we got the proper percentage of the revenue. And when you tell me from the Players Association side that you're just opposed to a cap of any form, my question is, okay, what if they said you could have 75% of the revenue? Would you be opposed to a cap? Because that's what happens with the salary cap. The players get a certain percentage of the revenue. Usually it's about 51, 52%. I believe in the other leagues. I don't know the other leagues that well.
Yeah.
But if the percentage was high enough, why wouldn't you take that? So I understand the philosophical argument, and it's one that they've made since forming the union back in the late 60s with Marvin Miller, early 70s. But at the same time, there's got to be a point where you would take that deal. And I don't know that the players see it that way, but practically speaking, why wouldn't you see it that way? If you can get X number of dollars in the pot and that pot is greater than it is now, that's something you'd have to look at. That said, I don't believe the owners intend to offer anything like what I'm talking about. So we're probably not in a good place. Now, there are people who also suggest you can do a salary floor without a cap. The owners say no to that. If you're getting a restriction on one end, we want a restriction on the other. I have thought, Chris, that a solution could be not a hard cap, but just make the luxury tax penalties harsher and then put a floor at the bottom, not a hard floor, but a floor that operates very much like the luxury tax thresholds operate right now. So, for instance, if you fall below, I don't know, X dollars in your payroll, then you're penalized. You lose a draft pick. And that's a way to keep the system going in some reasonable facsimile of its present form. And I don't know how the owners could say, well, that's not right because they're doing it at the top of the system. Why wouldn't you be able to do it at the bottom?
Yeah, yeah, no, that's a good point. Let's talk about something that's also been on a lot of people's minds is pitching injuries. And over the last 20 years, Ken, we've seen an increased focus on pitchers maxing out velocity and spin rate. This has seemingly led to a significant increase in injuries. We've also seen a meaningful decline in the number of innings pitched by starting pitchers and a related decline in high profile star pitchers. Very important. This has been something that's been a showcase for MLB for a long time. When I interviewed Commissioner Manfred, he agreed with me on both of those points. There have been rumors of possible remedies in the form of reducing the number of pitchers on the 26-man roster to 12 from 13 to encourage more innings for starters, and also a possible implementation of a 6-inning minimum for starting pitchers with some exceptions. Commissioner Manfred spoke directly about the innings minimum with me and felt that it was too blunt of an instrument and felt that the best way to address the issue was through some rule changes on roster movements that would encourage teams to develop pitchers so that they could pitch deeper into games and more innings. Pretty important issue. I think, look, both sides, the Players Association and the owners, both find this alarming with the injuries and, the lack of star pitching. What are your thoughts on all this?
I totally agree. It is alarming. And it's a trend in the game that has occurred for the reasons you said, the emphasis on velocity and stuff, breaking balls as sharp as possible, and it's gone too far. What has been lost is part of the attraction of the game that what we had or we experienced when we were younger, and that was the great starting pitcher matchup. When we were younger, well, really young, I'll date myself here, but if Tom Seaver was facing Bob Gibson, this is even before I was a fan, but if you had that kind of matchup,
Yeah.
a fan got excited. And those kinds of matchups existed not with just Hall of Fame pitchers, but with quality number two, three starters. They were really good starting pitchers throughout the game.
Yeah.
And something has been lost from an entertainment standpoint with what has happened with the injuries and the shorter starts and all of that, the de-emphasis on starting pitching. That's a concern for the commissioner, of course, because it's a business concern ultimately, and it's a concern for just the aesthetic value of the sport. Now, how do you fix it? That's the question. I'm with the commissioner on the 6-inning minimum being too blunt an instrument. I don't know that you can do that. There are other things that you can do. Roster size is one. It would have to be gradual, and you would have to phase these things in so teams could adjust and train their pitchers differently in the minor leagues. But that's one way to get to a better place. People have suggested change the strike zone, open it up a little bit more so pitchers throw more strikes, etc. I don't know that that's an answer. That might have unintended consequences the other way, but there are all kinds of possibilities that can be discussed here. And the positive part of what is going on right now is the discussion, is that baseball recognizes that there is a problem and is seemingly willing to address the problem. The issue is how best do you address it? And that's something that people have a hard time agreeing on. It's a healthy debate, it's a good, constructive
Yeah.
debate, and it's well-meaning on all sides. It's just what's the best way? And I don't know myself what the best way is. No one does.
If the team didn't, keep the pitcher in there, they were going to lose the DH for the rest of the game. I had never heard that before. Had you ever heard that?
Yes, my colleague at The Athletic, Jason Stark, kind of invented that idea. Well, the double hook rule. And I like that. That is, I should have mentioned this actually in the first answer. That is the kind of device that you can put into the game right away, a rules change that would have an immediate impact and it would increase strategy, which is always a good thing.
Yeah.
And it would have the effect of lessening the desire of managers to act as quickly as they do. They'd have to think twice about it. So
Yeah.
I should have mentioned that right at the top. That is, to me, an easy fix, one that they could implement next season for all we know,
Right. Right.
and it would improve the situation.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's, the injuries are certainly alarming. Nobody wants to see that. But, when I spoke with your former colleague, Joe Buck, I mean, he said without a doubt, he said, hey, when I was at Fox, he said, the best way that we could promote the big games, especially in the postseason, was through the big name starters. So I think it's something that's really, important to baseball going down the road and growing the game and keeping it popular.
Totally agree.
Yeah.
Totally.
All right, this next one is pretty funny. In my interview with Commissioner Manfred, I asked if the strike zone technology that we see on TV during broadcast is accurate. And he said, no, not at all. He would actually prefer that the technology not be used, but he said the networks like using it. Are you aware that it's not an accurate strike zone that we see on the TV screens?
I am aware of it. I don't know too much about it. I'm not involved in the Fox technological meetings or anything like that. I believe if it was completely distorted, they wouldn't use it. There probably is some question about it, but there is probably some truth to it too. And if you don't want to use that or you don't want to look at that, we have now these advanced actually websites that show you how umpires fare each game, and some are better than others. What we're going toward with the automatic ball strike system is essentially an elimination of that aspect of it, the inaccuracy, if you want to call it that, of what the networks do right now. But they're not there yet. And I know the commissioner wants to get there, and the sport is going to get there. And it's probably going to be a challenge system in which not every pitch is called by the ABS system, but you have, say, 3 challenges a game. And that to me would be a good thing. That way you would eliminate the egregious misses that umpires have from time to time. They're human beings. They make
Yeah.
mistakes at their job, just like I make mistakes at my job, just like everyone out there listening and watching makes mistakes at their job. I know that people don't like to admit that, but it happens. So I would like to see that implemented, but they've got to perfect it to a point where, hey, it's really accurate. It's got to be nails. And I don't know that they're there yet. If they were, they probably would be going toward that kind of technology and that system.
Yeah, I know the commissioner was really happy with the technology and felt that they hadn't really worked out all the kinks, but I guess it is going to be implemented in spring training this year. And I think his thinking was that there's a good chance it would be an MLB in 2026 on a challenge basis, as you said. He said we need to eliminate that big miss, at a crucial part of the game, which I get. And he kind of indicated to me that, probably down the road, this is going to be used to call every pitch. And, from my perspective as a fan, I say if you've got the technology and you're happy with it, call every pitch, right? I mean, let's just take the guesswork out, right? I mean, if a pitcher throws a ball, it should be a ball. If he throws a strike, it should be a strike. So I think his feeling was, hey, let's roll this out and we'll get there kind of like we've done with some other changes in the game. Let's not make it too abrupt at once. But I mean, I think it totally makes sense. If you're happy with the technology, have it call every pitch, right?
I tend to agree, Chris, but I remember when instant replay came into the game. And what was the idea? Get the egregious calls right, and that's it. That's what we want to do. And yet, there were unintended consequences. One being the play at second base on a runner sliding into the base and having to stay on the base because replay will catch him if he's off the base and they slap the tag on him. At that moment, his body is slightly off the base. He's safe, but
Yeah.
his body gets off the base, and then we have a situation where he's out. He shouldn't be out. So I fear unintended consequences with the ball strike system as well. It slows down games, perhaps. We'll see. I don't know how it is all going to play out, but I would like to see the gradual rollout. I know what you're saying. And yes, let's get every call right, but there'll be something lost too. Aaron Boone arguing with umpires, managers arguing with umpires, besides Aaron Boone. Those are part of the game's fabric. That's fun. And I know it's a product of imperfection, right? That they're
Yeah.
arguing because they feel something was wrong, but you're going to lose something. And my fear is you lose too much. So I want to see how it goes first. First of all, I want to see it to the point where they're getting Jose Altuve as accurately as they're getting Aaron Judge and vice versa. We have lots of different body types in this game,
Right.
and this thing has to be accurate to the nth degree for it
Yeah.
to work and be something that the public has confidence in.
Right, right. No, you listen, in our age, we have fond memories of Earl Weaver and Billy Martin, kicking dirt on umpires. We'll lose some of that eventually. And some people think that the real art of catchers framing pitches, is something that should not exit the game or, disappear. But I just think in terms of keeping the game moving and going, if something says that we all trust and say, hey, that technology is good, it's a ball or a strike. So I think we'll see how it goes in spring training this year, and maybe it'll be challenge system in 2026 in MLB.
We'll see. Yeah, quite possible.
All right, let me circle back, Ken, to what we were talking a little bit before. I think you can educate us a lot because I spoke to some people even who used to be involved in the game, and we were trying to figure out the revenue splits, the revenue sharing, and we couldn't quite put all the pieces together. But let me just start. So a good source recently indicated to me that the split of revenues between owners and players in MLB is about 50-50 when you consider the money spent by MLB in the minor leagues. So the NBA and NHL are about 50-50. The NFL is close, but a little lower for the players. I don't know, does this MLB split sound reasonable to you? And can you provide, educate us now as, what are all the revenue pieces? We've got revenue sharing, and how are we figuring out, all right, here are all the pieces, and, what's going to the players and what's staying with the owners? Can you help us out here?
I can try, though it's complicated and I don't
Yeah.
have a full understanding of it because they don't release their books, the owners, and even the union does not release all of the numbers that it knows. They keep
Okay.
these numbers confidential. When you talk about a team's revenue, you're talking about their local media revenue. You're talking about their share of the national television contract. You're talking about, obviously, day of game revenue, tickets, merchandise, parking, all of that. And you're probably talking about sponsorships. You are talking about sponsorships, all of those things. All of those things go into the revenue pie. And baseball has a system where each team contributes a certain percentage of its revenue to a pot, and then that revenue gets divided up, smaller markets getting more. So that's the way the system works according to the collective bargaining agreement. My feeling is that it doesn't always reflect accurately what teams are bringing in because teams have other financial interests that go outside of baseball but are related to baseball. And I'll give you an example. The development around Atlanta's Truist Park. That's a Atlanta Braves funded and developed area. They're getting revenue from that. Are they counting that toward where they are putting all their money in for baseball? I don't know how that works. And no one really knows how that works. We see the Atlanta Braves balance sheet because it's a publicly traded company. And we see that they're making a ton of money in the battery. I don't know that that revenue is going into the baseball aspect of it. So that doesn't necessarily count. And that's a concern for the Players Association. And that's when a team like the Cubs says, oh, we're just trying to break even. Well, are you breaking, again, as I said before, are you breaking even just on the baseball side, or you're breaking even when you count all this other stuff? So that is one part of it. And certainly with revenue sharing, there are teams like the Marlins and the A's who are getting 70 to 80 million dollars a year. That money is supposed to go back into baseball. Now, it doesn't have to go into major league payroll. It can go into player development, scouting, international scouting, anything. But are those teams spending that money the way they're supposed to be spending it? I'm not always convinced that that is the case.
Right, right. Yeah, and I mean, just to get an idea of the disparity, I'm trying to think offhand. I mean, the Dodgers local television, program, cable deal probably pays them north of $300 million a year, right? I mean, I think it's that big of a number. And I would bet that there are some teams, MLB teams, whose local regional TV deal is probably 20 million or less. I mean,
Yes.
what a disparity we're talking now. 48% of those revenues from the Dodgers are ultimately going to go into this revenue sharing pool, but that's 52% of 300 something million that they're keeping in their coffers every year. I mean, that is just an amazing disparity.
It is, and that's why the commissioner wants to establish a nationalized package for streaming services the next time that the national TV contracts expire, which is after the 2027 season, going into 28. I believe that's right. Actually, no, it's after 28. So he wants to establish something where it's one big happy family with regard to TV rights. And the big market teams like the Dodgers, the Yankees, and the Mets are going to say, well, why? We paid extra money to get these teams because they play in big markets. We negotiated these deals because we are in big markets. Why should we be subject to the same kinds of things that the Cleveland Guardians are? Now, the corollary to this is if you establish a salary cap and you have two shared revenue pools, I guess you would say. Actually, I'm saying the same. Let me go back on that. If you have a salary cap, then perhaps the large market teams would be more willing to share their revenue because you'd have total revenue sharing in every way, right? And that's
Yeah.
what the salary cap is revenue sharing with the players, revenue sharing among the owners, etc. I just don't see the big market teams going for that. And I don't know that it's fair to even ask them to do that. Now, can you tweak the formulas to make it where the big market teams are donating even more to the small market teams? Yeah, you can do that. But in my opinion, if you want to do that, then let's see these small market teams spend a little bit more than they're spending, maybe even a lot more than they're spending. And if I'm a big market team, if I'm the Yankees, the Dodgers, the Mets, the Phillies, I'm asking the question, hey, you want to increase the amount I'm giving these teams? Well, let's see them spend it. Let's see this supposed competitive balance question be resolved in the way that it is intended to be resolved. And that's the quandary within the game.
Yeah, and just to add, it would be such a monumental change for the big market teams. However, that's how things work in the NFL, right? I mean, there's no local regional. It's everything is controlled by the NFL, all TV. So it basically
Because
be
yeah,
following
because they
that.
play 16 games and every game is on national television. It's
Right.
different. And yes, if baseball could get to that, congratulations. I just don't see that evolution taking place because of this game's historical foundation on local revenue. It's a different sport. They play
Yeah.
162. If you can pull it off, I guess, but you're going to have to get the players to agree to a salary cap. That's not going to be easy. I just am very skeptical of the plan. I admire the ambition. I understand what Manfred wants, the right thing from his
Yeah.
perspective, but I just don't see how it will be executed.
Yeah, so I started out by saying, my source said, hey, it's basically 50-50 split at this point. We take into consideration what the team spent on the minor league. So I think what's been really good in all of major sports the last few years is, the player side has really come up, right? And I think Commissioner Manfred's point to me, what that was, hey, if we're 50-50, we're in the same boat together, right? All our objective now is just see, all right, what can we do to increase every dollar that we're making because we're partners now. And I think that is important. And I don't know if there's still going to always be differing objectives, but I think it's probably good that the money's gotten so big, and now kind of both sides can start to say, "Hey, we're equal partners at this point. Let's just make sure we can maximize the dollar." So
And that's the argument for a salary cap. Hey,
exactly.
more partners in this, and we'll grow the game together. The
Yeah.
players are understandably skeptical, given the
Right.
history of the relationship between the owners and the players. And frankly, in my opinion, and I know this will be in contrast to what the commissioner might say, you can have a good relationship as it is right now without having a salary cap, a better relationship. And you know what? In some ways, the relationship has improved, though every 5 years when the CBA expires, we have World War, you know what. So, there's a long way to go in labor relations for the sport. And
Yeah.
it's just something that I'm dreading because in 2 years we're going to have a big, big problem because of all these things we're discussing, all these things that
Yeah.
maybe the game or the league wants to implement and the players will resist. The owners also have a problem amongst themselves, the big market versus the small market. That's been a historic problem in the sport as well.
Yeah. I think, you know, there's been a tough relationship without a doubt, historically between the Players Association and MLB. And probably at this point, I think the other major leagues, the relationship has gotten better. I know the NBA has a really good relationship. I think the NFL relationship's gotten a lot better. But as you know, probably about 10 or 11 years ago, I was working on something with some other partners in terms of financial guarantees for the players. And obviously, the Players Association liked what we were doing, and MLB didn't. But I will say, I mean, everything that we discussed, with the Players Association, I know there was an internal calculation going on everything. Like, hey, how are the owners going to react to this?
It's never easy from a reporter's standpoint to cover because the two sides, the players and the owners, have very diametrically opposed views of the world. And beyond that, that's the essence of the problem. But the other problem is there is a historic distrust between the parties. And I don't need to go through it why that distrust exists, but it exists and it's not going away anytime soon.
Ken, I think most would agree that speeding up MLB games over the last few years has been a big victory. Thanks to pitch clock, limitations on pickoff attempts, limitation on mound visits, and the extra innings ghost runner, average game lengths have declined by 34 minutes to about 2 hours and 36 minutes in the last few years. Now that we have faster games, maybe the next question is, do we have too many strikeouts in MLB? The strikeout rate has increased to about 24% from 17% in '06. I would think it's fair to say that fans would like to see more action in the form of balls in play. We've heard a fair amount of suggestions from lowering the mound to shrinking the strike zone. Does MLB have a strikeout problem? And if so, what's the best solution to address it?
Yes, it has a strikeout problem. I don't know the best solution. And the problem is kind of tied to the pitch clock. When the commissioner introduced the pitch clock, what he was talking about was not only shortening games, but he kept referring to pace of game. They want the games to move along. And when balls are in play, there are more possibilities that can happen on the field. There are just more action moments. And that is what the sport needs to get back to. Now, to some degree, this has evolved much like the slowdown of the game evolved because of different philosophies that came into the game. So, with the shortening of starting pitching, right? With shorter starts that led to more relievers, that led to a slower game. In the offensive part of the game, the offensive side, you've seen a greater emphasis on power, much like the greater emphasis on power on the pitching side. And that has led to an increased number of strikeouts. If you're swinging for the fences, in that proverbial phrase, you are generally going to strike out more. So there has to be something or a number of things done to increase the value of simply making contact, putting the ball in play, or increasing the possibility of that happening. And there are a number of ways to do that. The strike zone is certainly one. And the problem with the strike zone is you adjust it. There might be other things that take place, and
Yeah.
it's a concern. But all of these changes we've talked about with regard to bringing back the starting pitcher and bringing more action into the game, they're all kind of tied together. If you bring back the starting pitcher, well, maybe then you're not having relievers every night starting in the fourth inning, coming out of the bullpen, throwing 95 or above, and making it that much more difficult to hit.
Yeah.
Granted,
Yeah.
starting pitchers are always difficult to hit too, but as we've
Right.
seen, third time through the order, the numbers from the offensive perspective go up. So all of these things are tied together, and I think the goal is and should be a better entertainment product. And I'm not sure how to get there, but I know that the sport should get there.
Yeah, we're going to keep you moving. I don't want to dwell on this too long, but it goes to show how complicated these things are, right? Because then you've got a certain number of fans who say, "Hey, I love home runs," right? So I mean,
Right.
there's been a positive corration between the strikeouts and I guess saying, "Hey, it's so hard for me to put a ball in play. I'm going to swing as hard as I can, and I'm going to hit more home runs." And that those players actually have been rewarded in contracts for that. So Obviously, very, very complicated issues. And I will say one thing. Commissioner Manfred made it very clear to me that they take very seriously, the feedback they get from the fans, and they really try to address the issue. So you've got to get back to work. I'm going to hit you with one more question. We greatly appreciate your time. Now, let me get through this quickly. Now, born and raised in New York. I live in South Florida now. So let's talk about the Marlins. I think it's always been easy to say that Florida baseball teams have a hard time developing a large fan base because so many Floridians come down from other states and already have established baseball roots. But I'm not so sure about that. The NBA's Miami Heat currently sit fourth on the all-time NBA consecutive game sellout list, fourth in history. The streak was established with the championship teams anchored by LeBron, Dwayne Wade, and Chris Bosh, and the streak continues today as the franchises continue to put together great competitive teams. Marlins attendance last year was 29th, beating out only the A's. They finished last place in the tough NL East division with a 62-100 record. You wrote recently that we've got this rule where if they take in $70 million in revenue sharing, they've got to spend 1.5 times on that in salary, and I don't know if they're anywhere close to that. So any idea, what's going on down here with Bruce Sherman? Derek Jeter added a lot of excitement, but that didn't work out. He's gone. What's going on with the franchise down here, Ken? Any thoughts?
They've got a lot of challenges. There's no doubt about it. And they built a ballpark that is beautiful, but is not that accessible. It's tough to get to. And that's one of the problems that they face. The other problem is this team has never sustained success. They've had their moments, and then they've taken a step backward. They did it under Bruce Sherman just a couple of years ago. They make the playoffs, and then all of a sudden they hire a new general manager and start trying to adopt the Tampa Bay Rays model in which they're spending a lot less money, they're bringing in prospects, and they're just getting rid of any players who have higher salaries. And that's not a way to build a fan base. So they've got a number of challenges. And obviously, there's always the question, too, in Florida. A lot of people have other things to do. But as you mentioned, the Heat have done well. The Dolphins are an institution in Miami. So why can't the Marlins, in a baseball mad area, a heavily Latin area where the sport is extremely popular, why can't they do better? And it's a fair question. And it seems to me that this team, anytime it gets to the point where it has to spend some money, ownership retreats. And that's not just this ownership. It's happened time and time again with the Florida Miami franchise.
Yeah, it has. It has. And I'm for what it's worth, I'm going to make a prediction as to what happens. And from what I understand, the team is not for sale because if it is Bruce Sherman, I know some people that would like to buy it. But there's been so much money that's come down into the Miami area. We've got Billionaires Road down at Indian Creek Island and Star Island. I think one of these billionaires, they'll either come together or someone say, hey, we live right there, let's buy that out. And maybe that's what his thought is. Give me a quick idea. You don't know the numbers, but if he's taking in 70 million and he's got to spend, that plus another $35 million, can they possibly be making money, bringing in $13,000 per game?
I don't know. I don't know exactly how it works there, but again, when you get that much money in revenue sharing, it should be reflected in the on-field product. And it isn't with Miami often. And that's why they are the subject, as are other clubs, of a grievance by the Players Association. These things pop up from time to time. And if they don't get to that 105, there will be another grievance. And maybe the Miami Marlins just say, well, let them have a grievance. These things never seem to get resolved that quickly anyway. That might be their strategy. But at the same time, that's not a healthy way to go about it.
I agree. Ken, you have been so kind to join us. You're still in the middle of free agent signings. We're going to let you go. Appreciate you joining us on Questions for Cancer Research. You've done so much for yourself with your bow ties for all the charitable organizations. Congratulations to you on that and on all your success. Thank you so much for joining us, and we wish you all the best.
Chris, thank you very much for having me.